Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 422 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today we have a special tribute episode for Merran Esson, who recently passed away. This episode is a rebroadcast of our 2013 interview where we talk about learning to trust one's inner voice, as well as how she captured the passage of time within the objects that she made. She was a longtime teacher and the head of ceramics at the National Art School in Sydney, and through that position helped numerous students to forge their own path in ceramics. In this interview, you'll also be able to hear Merran's sense of humor, which will sorely be missed. She had this almost childlike gleam in her eye when she would rib you or give you a hard time about something that you were saying, which is one of the qualities that I love the most about her. There's going to be a couple memorials in her honor that are coming up in the next week or so, including one on June the 28th, at the cell block at the National Art School. You can find out more about that as well as how to RSVP at merranesson.com. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So when did you start teaching? What was your first teaching gig?
Oh my God, my first teaching gig. I didn't do teacher training. So I did a ceramic diploma down in Melbourne. And then I came up to live in Sydney about a year later. And I got a job in a private girls' school here in Sydney. And I'd never really taught before. So my first day in front of the classroom was my first day in front of kids. Whereas, if you do a diploma of teaching or a Bachelor of Education, you do 13 weeks of prac teaching where you've got somebody watching over you. So it was I got in very much as a specialist rather than as an art educator. So yeah, that was my first one. So I did 4 years in high school. And then, and I actually resigned that job because I was starting a family and I just knew I wanted to have time at home. So I very slowly got into TAFE, Technical and Further Education, and community art centres. And, it's interesting now because my job, it's one of the cream jobs in Australia. I mean, I always say to people, I'm the luckiest girl in Australia because I have the cream job. I think I have the best job in Australia. And that was never a career path. It never occurred to me. I think we can plan out things that we want to do. Never occurred to me I'd have that job. And I guess you don't fall into things. You do actually work towards them, but without realising where you're going. And so there's a lot of young students coming out of art education that say, oh, I've got my eye on your job, or I'd love to have a job like yours. And, I have to say to them, well, look, it's one of the premier jobs and you have to work for it. And you have to go around and you have to drive from Hornsby I've driven from Hornsby to St. George in a day to do a morning class in St. George and then an afternoon class in Hornsby with a 1 hour drive between in a sort of 1 hour lunch break. And you hope the car won't break down. You hope you get there in time. And because you have to do that, you have to build up and get all those skills so that when a terrific job comes up, then you're poised and ready to get it if you want it. And I didn't really realise until about 2 or 3 years before I got the job I'm in now that actually this was a career path that I'd probably always realised was there but had never really worked for.
Yeah, you'd been heading in that direction.
But the other thing is you've got to make work. You've got to have an exhibiting profile too in an art college. So that does mean you're teaching in community colleges. I remember it's also interesting that you never know who's in the audience. And I remember, when I came back, I lived in Scotland for a year in 93 and 94, and I came back and there was no teaching around, and I sent out some little booklets to high schools. And we were talking today with the students about Matthias Osterman, who'd come to Australia, and he had these very specific, this was a 3-hour workshop, this was a 6-hour workshop, this was a 2-day workshop. So I put together this little booklet of all the workshops that I could run, and I sent it out to all the private schools because I knew they had money. Private schools in Australia are, fee-paying students. And this private school called St Catherine's in Waverley rang me up and asked me if I'd do just a presentation to the students. I think it was a 45-minute lesson. So I spent all night. It was before internet. It was before PowerPoint. So I did a slide, got the carousel with slides in it, and I put 3 milk crates together with pots in them. And I spent the morning loading up the car, and then I got there and unloaded the car and did the talk and loaded up the car again. I mean, it really completely was a day, to be honest. And I think I got paid something like $57.94, or, it might have been $76.94, and I thought, oh, seriously? I do all that? I'm not going to do that again. What I didn't know was that Glenn Israel, who was the head of the art department, was writing a book for high school, for visual arts, for high school. And, it was a she, but cool. she was writing this book, and she put me in the book. I'm in the same chapter as Miro. And look, I can't remember now, it was called Visual Arts. The book came out, and there I was at a double page, and there was a whole framework about how I operate as an artist. And I'm studied now in the high school certificate curriculum. For $75 or whatever it was probably the best $75 I've ever earned in my life, because it opened up my profile within the high school system, and ultimately probably was also partly responsible for where I've ended up now. So I think we can never presume that it's not worth doing a talk for $70 or turning up to do a demonstration for a group of community artists in a community centre where maybe you won't even get paid to do it. And I think we've all done those things. And if you become precious about what you will do or you won't do, you just keep your doors closed. So I guess it was just a fact of finding a door partly open and going through it.
Those early years of teaching, how did you judge your progress as a teacher? Because you didn't come out of that academic system.
Wow. I don't know. I don't know that I ever did. I mean, I think sometimes there are people that instinctively were probably meant to be teachers, and that's not me saying I was, but my mother was a teacher, and perhaps she was a very good teacher, with me being probably the prime pupil. And occasionally, she was an English teacher. Oh, she used to make me spell because I was a terrible speller. And occasionally when I get the grammar wrong in a sentence,
you can hear her voice in
I'll
the back
look
of
up
your
to him
head.
and I'll go, sorry, Mum, I got that one wrong. Or, I'll even say to my students, oh, my mother would be appalled if she could hear me say that. But I think that's also endearing to students when they know that you're as human as they are, and you're not always going to be academically correct in putting together a sentence when you're trying to explain something and you've got tongue-tied. But no, I don't know how. I mean, I suppose you judge that from the response you get back from your students.
Right, all based on what works.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it is instinctive. I mean, I think my weakness as a teacher is that I'm not a very technical person. And that sometimes worries me, that I'm not particularly good at adjusting glazes. But I guess that, as long as I've got somebody on staff that is good at that, then there's somewhere for the students to go. And I think a very good teacher also knows where the resources are, because students are going to come at you with really strange problems to solve. And I think you've got to be able to say, I can't solve that problem right now, but I actually know some places where you could go. And when I first started teaching, it was a matter of having Frank and Janet Hamer's book sort of beside me, so I could sort of say, just hang on a second while I go to the staff room, and I could go running back with the answer. Or now I'm much more honest and say, look, there's this great book, let's go and have a look and see what we can find in there, because that's a terrific book for every ceramic artist should have a copy of that, or at least access to it.
Is that the faults and glaze remedies?
Well, it's got that in it, but it's called a Dictionary of Ceramic Materials and Techniques. It's probably more of the Bible than than Bernard Leach's A Potter's Book, because it really has. And it's also a book I'll often say to the students when they, when they're saying, I don't know if I'm doing enough research. And I remember Bronwyn Kemp, who's one of my lecturers, saying, well, they should just take Hayman's dictionary, put it next to the bed and open it at any page. They're going to find something that's of interest. And I think Bronwyn's absolutely right. You just need to have access to that book and you can find out all sorts of things that you didn't know you knew. But I think technology now is so much easier. I mean, when I was a student at college, it was Daniel Rhodes' Clay and Glazes for the Potter, and all the photographs were in black and white.
And half the material analysis were wrong. And
well, they probably weren't wrong. They're wrong now because those pits have closed, And I was talking to you earlier that I was talking with one of the clay suppliers here, and clay ceram. The pits for clay ceram in Australia will all be finished within the next year. And whilst there's other pits for clay ceram opening in Australia, the chemical composition will be quite different. So clay makers are going to have to change their clays. Probably the last people to find out, and this is probably not a bad thing for other potters to know, that, clay manufacturers you'll be the last people that they'll tell. They'll change their clay recipes, and you'll get a bag of something, potash feldspar or ball clay, and you'll buy and things will start to dunt and glazes won't fit, and you'll wonder what you've done wrong. Actually, you've not done anything wrong. The materials have changed. So I guess the books that are written are only as good as the materials that are available at that time. Yeah. And, that does change, because we're such a little pimple on the back of the huge elephant of ceramic production. And we're the last ones to find out.
Working in Jingdezhen really showed me that, because some of those studios, they're taking orders of 100,000 plates. So if I want to go in and buy a feldspar, sometimes they just look at you like, you want how many tons? It's like, no, I just want a bag.
Yeah, I think, I buy 5 bags of clay at a time.
Right. And that'll last you.
Nobody will give me a discount on that.
Right.
You have to buy a couple of tons. But Jingdezhen's an interesting story. I mean, I love Jingdezhen because I went there with Roger Law, who was making a lot of work there. And he knew where the glaze ladies were. And, copper red in reduction is such a luscious glaze. And to be able to get your work fired in Jingdezhen and have somebody who's already developed the glaze for the clay. I mean, I always jokingly say to students, I'm an urban potter. I like my clay delivered on my doorstep in a plastic bag ready to use. And I wouldn't mind my glazes that same way as well, in some ways, if you know what it is you want to do.
And it's interesting when you isolate the elements there and you say, okay, these 3 glazes I know work. So I'm going to use these 3 glazes in this clay body. It makes the choices that you make all more about your design choice than, I'm going to take 10 years and try to figure this glaze out. Because someone else in China already took 100 years to figure it out 300 years ago. So we don't need to do that. It makes it simpler in some ways.
I mean, I guess if you are getting the little lady in China to do your copper red glazes, and they're going to be the same on my pots as they will be on Roger Law's pots and anybody else who uses that glaze. And I think that's one of the things that Bill Samuels, who ran the ceramics department at the National Art School before me, he taught me, if you actually want something that's completely different to what other people do, then you need to take a trailer and a shovel and go out the other side of the mountain over there and dig the clay and put your own bits of feldspar and rock and things into them. And I think that thing that happens by accident is really exciting. And for my own work, I know that I will always mix up my own glazes, because that way I do have some control over the work that I can bring out. But you'll never find, there's a great book on the market, you might know, it's called Smashing Glazes, and I went through that one day and looked at different glazes. I've used Mark Luthol's barium purple glaze in there, and it works, it's fantastic, works in Australia with Australian materials. Thank you, Mark Luthol. But I don't think you'll ever find a book that's got a Merran Esson glaze in it, because I've never really developed one. I've stolen from everybody else and sometimes manipulated, changed materials, changed the amounts of the materials, and like any good recipe, and I often talk to the students about this, like a spaghetti bolognese recipe, you have to tweak things and make them fit your own work. So I actually like that is a play that's really exciting.
As we're sitting in your apartment looking at these pot or forms that you've made, this green glaze has become somewhat of a signature. That surface, not always exactly the same color, but that surface, and it works so well for your work. You know, the texture you're doing and the way you build the forms. But what's interesting is I find that students often will look at someone like you and say, "Oh, that glaze is special because she's making it." When really it's you have the idea, you have the hands touching the clay, and you have the glaze. So it's like three things coming together to make it.
There's also been a lot. You're seeing the best of the pots here. There's quite a few that are in landfill because they haven't worked. And the green glaze doesn't always work every time. One of the reasons why it's quite different on different pots is it's different firings. It's a different bag of potash feldspar. I mean, most of the potash feldspar that we're using here at the moment is coming in from India.
Oh, okay.
And that's only happened in the last couple of years. So it'll be a different chemical composition. I think that's made a huge change. I mean, I'll say, you know, the glaze that I'm using, that's this green glaze, was a glaze that Simone Fraser, who is one of our great dry glaze experts here, she published it in a Pottery in Australia magazine in 1993 or 94. And I tried it out on something and it really didn't work. It was kind of brown with speckles in it and it wasn't what I wanted. I didn't know at that stage I wanted green. And I was firing work with another dry glaze on it. Simone went through Canberra School of Art with Alan Peascott as her teacher, so he was the great guru of dry glazes. So she learned a lot about that. And it was only a couple of years later that I tried that same glaze again that she'd published with a little less copper in it, a little bit more lithium, because the lithium gives it a really lovely sheen, over different coloured slips. And there was one particular slip where it just pinged, it just bounced. Well, I shouldn't say ping because that might to us sound like it's pinging off. No, but it just kind of shone at me. And, you scratch your head for a while and think, wow, there might be something in this. And so slowly you sort of develop it as a glaze by trying different coloured slips under it. And we've both discovered, one of the things that she wrote in the article then was that dry glazes are incredibly sensitive to the clay that's underneath them. Right. They're also incredibly sensitive to the clay that's in them. So one of the things that I did with that was I took it to the glaze lab and tested it with all the ball clays and kaolins and fire clays. Any clay that was in the glaze lab I tested in that glaze. And I got 7 or 8 different glazes with it. And then for a while our copper carbonate was pretty crappy. The glazes had a lot of brown in them for a while, and I kept looking at the copper carbonate and you could see little flecks of brown in it. And it was a cheap carbonate that was coming in from somewhere that was being sold through the pottery shops. And that kind of clued me into the fact that I was going to change my source for copper carbonate. So, there's a couple of kiln notes there that you won't ever see. They're not on the shelf behind me here because they were really dull and boring, and so you throw them out. So I've recently just had a conversation again with somebody that I buy a ready-made engobe from. This is kind of an interesting story in a way because when I was a student at college in the 1970s, we were using a clay company. I was in Melbourne, so we were using a local clay company down there. And the finest white clay that you could get then was a sort of fine white, but it was a stoneware clay. And I used it in all my making for the next 10 years. And then I started hand building with a much tougher clay. And then I went back to this company because they had an engobe that I could buy. So I bought that and I put that on the surface of my work, put the glazes over the top, and something really exciting happened. When I was writing my master's thesis, one of my examiners wanted the technical information of the things I used. And I thought, well, no company's going to give me their technical information. So I rang the company up and had a talk with the guy there who I know quite well. And he said, oh, that's just our fine white stoneware clay. And I thought, isn't it interesting how you can have a circle that spans, 25 years, where a clay that I'd been using as a student and a recent graduate and had not used, because nice porcelains had come on the market and other things. And I was only using it as a skin over the top of a pretty tough, sandy hand-building clay. But it was the same clay body. And I just thought, sometimes you don't move very far from something. We think we do, and we try all sorts of things, but there's some little common thread that runs through. And I guess that's the one thing, maybe even when I think about my own teaching, is that I don't think my job is to tell students what to make. It's to try and help students to find something that comes quite naturally to them, and it's more instinctive. And they're not going to find it in 3 years. I hate to tell them that. You can't tell them that at the beginning. That's going to take another 5 or 6 years after they leave college. And everybody probably told you that, and people told me that. But there'll be things that are just instinctive to the way you want to work. You know, ways that I put my hands on the clay, or ways that I bang out a slab, or the sort of clay that I choose to use.
So was your early work always hand built? Is this something that developed? Were you a thrower or slip caster?
Never was a slip caster. I hated plaster. I've actually taught slip casting, but I don't enjoy it. I'd rather employ other people now that I'm in a role where I can employ people. Right. In fact, I found a really lovely rock out in the desert that I wanted a mould of, so I made a kind of plaster negative of it. And when I brought it back to Sydney, I just gave it to Som Chaitarian and just said, would you please make a mould of this? How much would you charge me? So that was quite lovely. Look, yeah, I can throw, and there's some bowls over there that I've thrown. They're pretty heavy. I think when I met Sandy Lockwood, who I think is one of the most amazing throwers in Australia, I just knew right there and then that I was never going to throw commercially because she has a touch with clay that means that, you know, I would always buy her pots and give them as thrown gifts rather than make them myself. You have these kind of moments, I think, in life when something kind of hits you like a little beam of light. And I remember, I've told this story a lot to students, and I was driving to Melbourne, and really that part of the story is irrelevant, except that I was driving, and you know, when you're driving, your mind wanders. And I ended up having this conversation with myself, and it was a conversation about refined, very slick work, which I'm very attracted to. And I tried to make it. I was working with coloured clay, and I was trying to make this very slick work. But working with coloured clay means you can't put your finger marks all over it. You've got to keep it really precise. And so this conversation which is going on between me and my sort of subconscious, and I was saying to it, I want to make this really refined work. And my subconscious said, but you're no good at that. And yes, but if I keep working at it, I'll get better at it. And my subconscious says, but you're just flogging it. Why would you bother? And so I asked my subconscious, what should I be doing? And it said, you're better at making slightly wonky, off-centered pots that have got a bit of kind of imbalance to them. And I remember exactly where I was on the Hume Highway between Sydney and Melbourne when this revelation hit me. I almost drove off the road with excitement, and I couldn't wait to get back to Sydney. And from that moment, I don't try and make that work anymore at all. I go for the slightly wonky, off-centered, organic work. I then went home I come from a country farm halfway between Sydney and Melbourne, and I went home to the farm one day and I took my mother to a Pioneer Women's Museum, which is about 10 miles from the farm, which is near Tumbarumba. It's on the edge of the Snowy Mountains. And the women there had collected this museum. You would have loved it, actually, because it was all sorts of country craft, things that had been made, particularly through the Depression, when there'd be a cup that was chipped, or the handle had broken off, and there'd be a bed spring that was kind of clipped onto the rim of the cup.
That is way cool.
And did a little sort of loop and then clipped onto the bottom of the cup. And I'm explaining this to you, and nobody can see what I'm doing with my fingers.
I know exactly what you mean, though.
And I love going into that museum. Actually, I've got photos of it, so I'll show it to you later. But behind this, and so there was all sorts of fabulous little things there, and I really felt, I guess there was an empathy there because I come from the country and I'd been taught to cook and sew and crochet and mend things and make things. And up behind the museum, thrown against a tree, was an old water tank. And the country water tank in Australia is a bit of an icon. If anybody saw Baz Luhrmann's Australia, the little Aboriginal boy was hiding in the water tank, and they rust away and they get holes in them and they leak after a while. And I remember helping my dad repair a water tank when we were little. He'd get inside it with this tar and heshen and repair it. And water, of course, is a huge issue in sort of rural Australia, not so much on coastal Australia, but in sort of inland Australia. And this tank was busted. It had a really lovely kind of swerve to it, but it was still broken and discarded. And I remember looking at it and I was just so inspired by it that I came back to Sydney and started running my fingers along the clay in the sort of corrugated way. I mean, it's completely different to corrugations, which are raised, and my fingers, of course, weren't. They were kind of gouging a track. But actually, to people looking at the work, they don't see that. You know, the normal person just sees it as a sort of corrugation. And that was really the moment when the detritus and, I guess stuff, that sort of stuff from farms that's lost its function, became the magic component to my work. And then the green glaze just sort of worked on that, because the green glaze, to me, is a sort of verdigris copper. It's not meant to be green, to do anything to do with green pastures or
it's not growth green.
No, it's not growth green. It's actually a verdigris decay green. And the fact that it has this really lovely bronzy look, which now means that some of my work can look as though it has been cast in bronze with a patina on it. It's really lovely. But that's how clay can mimic.
Right. Anything. Yeah. So how does the sense of time affect your work? Because I feel like that a lot of these relate to stone in some ways, and they relate to metal, like the aged metal. But in terms of you as an artist, when you look at these, are you thinking about the passage of time?
Always. Absolutely. And I'm thinking about it as a passage of time into the future as well, which is sort of fascinating. God, there's about 3 answers to that comment. Which one is the most interesting one? Have you got time for the whole 3? You said this might go for an hour, it might go all night. I'm not conscious of it I wasn't conscious of it when I started. I mean, I think when I started doing this sort of work, I was conscious of a rural, always metallic influence. So it was, and then when I thought back, there's a sculptor called Jake Harvey, and I remember reading in a book about his work that he remembered, conversations with his grandfather about objects. He wasn't a ceramic artist. He made sort of stone and metal sculpture. But I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I remember stories with my grandfather. And I guess you'd think, well, stories with my grandfather are really not that important. God, they're hugely important, because they're the things that make us think about our past and our present and potentially our future. But he died when I was 10. So this conversation with my grandfather would have happened when I was probably 8 or 9. And, my mother was a sort of country artist, and we used to go painting. She taught me how to do a watercolour painting, and it was the grand vista. You know, I'd sit on a rock and I'd try and paint the snowy mountains in the background and the trees in the foreground, and I never really liked it. It was too big a vista. I was always much more interested in trying to do a painting of a 44-gallon drum or a little area of a post or something. But I remember going down to the machinery shed with my grandfather, and he was the Mr. Fix-It, so he'd fire up this forge, and I'd work the bellows to get the fire going, and then if we had to shoe the horses or if he had to fix a ploughshare, he would hammer the metal when it was glowing red. I loved that. I thought that was fascinating. Now, as an 8-year-old, I didn't say, one day I'm going to make ceramics and play with fire. But
it got catalogued.
Yeah, catalogued, that's good. Yeah, when I look back on that, I know it was pivotal. So when you look at this work and I see the country influence there, first of all, it's metallic, and I think it's absolutely to do with my grandfather and those moments. And they came back years later to sort of remind me. I think the stone influence is interesting too, because 2 years ago I was invited to go to a research station about an hour and a half north of Broken Hill, which is about 2 days' drive west of Sydney. It's sort of halfway between Sydney and Ayers Rock. It's where Mad Max was filmed. If anybody's seen Mad Max. Yeah, absolutely. Straight roads. And I was the only ceramic artist invited in this group. There were 13 of us, 11 of us, and the others were all painters and drawers. So for me, it was kind of fascinating to pit myself in the fine art world against that, because ceramics is so embedded in process and so embedded in a history of craft. And whilst there are some artists that have managed to transcend that, and I'm thinking about people like, Picasso and Miro who worked in oils, and probably Jeff Koons who's sold pieces for $5 million. But for most of us, it's a pretty lowly material to work with. And I went out there and I thought, I'll dig some clay. Well, I did. I dug some clay out there. It's crap clay out there. It's full of sand. It's the reason why it's the desert. But there were lots of rocks out there, and I spent 2 weeks really looking at subject matter and looking at rocks. And, in its very simplest form, that's what we do in ceramics. We take a very soft, malleable material and we fashion it into something, and then we put it in a kiln.
And turn it into a rock.
And which is like a volcano, and we turn it into a rock. And so I was sort of fascinated in that, and there's a little SoundCloud where I had to speak for 90 seconds when I was out there to the ABC journalist, and I just sort of said, ceramics is really about the study of geology, and geology is about the study of time. And in fact, when you're asking me about the time to take these, I'm constantly thinking about the time it takes for rock to weather down into clay, and the time it takes for us to then fire it back up into rock again. And the third part of that really was that I do think about where this work will sit. And I guess it means, I think back to work from historical museums where you might go in and look at, you go to the V&A in London or the Museum of the American Indian in New York. And you look at the work that's been fashioned over centuries by primitive and tribal cultures. And you realise that actually our means haven't changed very much in the 3,000 or 4,000, 5,000 years that we've been looking at work that's come out of those Mediterranean cultures and some of those South American cultures, and particularly the African cultures. So what does that mean, in years to come? And I look at my work and I think, wow, I wonder what my work where will my work be in 300 years' time when I'm not here to push it? And this is an interesting conversation for you and I to have, because we've been talking today about how in the 21st century we can, sort of work on our profiles through social media and those aspects. So if I'm not around to have a Facebook page and put up photos of my work and start a blog and have a website, well, maybe the website will still be there. Yeah. But where will the pieces be? Because the pieces in museums might occasionally pop up, but in 300 years' time I might be such a minor artist that it won't make any difference. Thinking about my own family tree, and I'm actually related to a very well-known Scottish explorer. And when my mother told me this, because we were studying him at school, I was incredibly impressed that I was related to this man, and I thought, wow, how exciting to be related to somebody who did something really amazing with their life. So it kind of made me think about how my life might be seen, not by the general public, because I once said this in a lecture and it was completely misunderstood that I wanted to be famous, and I didn't and I don't. But I was interested in how I might be seen in the long view, but by my descendants.
Ah, okay.
I'm more interested in what my great-great-great-grandchildren will care about rather than what Joe Blow from the street might find out. Just because I gave a lecture to high school students many years ago and ended up in one textbook, I don't have any great tickets on the fact that that'll still be around. So where are my descendants going to get my work from? Because actually, if I've got good work, it nearly always sells. So I thought, it's going to come from the kitchen cupboard. So I had a very revealing moment 3 years ago when my mother passed away, and I went back down to the family home and cleared out the cupboards, and there were all the pots I'd given her over the years. Now, my mother, like most mothers, never used anything that I gave her. So I learned pretty quickly the teapot I gave her had a crack in the handle. And there's a coffee cup I gave her, which I'd actually made in a mould, and just to see if the clay was thick enough, I'd stuck a pointy tool in there. And then I thought the glaze would cover it, but it didn't. So when you put boiling water in the cup, there's a pool of boiling water on the table. This is why Sandy Lockwood can throw and I can't. And so I have this vision that my great-great-great-great-grandchildren in 300 or 400 years' time are going to say, that's great-great-grandmother Merran's pots in the cabinet over there, but look, don't use them because they're all crap. She was bloody terrible. So the moral of the story is you've got to give your mother your best work because it's the work that'll stay in the family. And I am sort of conscious when you ask about time. It's a long three-pronged answer to your question, but I am conscious of time. And I guess now I'm more conscious than ever of the work that will remain and be my sort of legacy.
Your legacy, sure.
Is it a legacy to the collectors of the world and the museums of the world? God, who knows? I can't control that. Right. It'd be lovely to think that in 300 years' time my work might suddenly pop up I do have a piece in the National Gallery in Canberra, but that the curator in 300 years' time will deem for it to come out. Probably not. So I'm more interested in how it might sit within the context of my family, people who may, like I have a, some sort of respect for who I might have been within their family context. Mm-hmm. God, that's all you can do.
But I like that you're making it in that sense that it's so personal that you're giving it meaning because you're thinking about the timelessness of the surface and how that will be conveyed by your grandkids. That's intimacy for me in a different way, because a lot of times intimacy is construed as person to person, but you're thinking like person to generation. And I think that gives it more meaning. It's almost like the way that burial goods were made, that these things, that people were buried with these things because they were significant, but they knew that they may never be found because it was really for the afterlife. But they probably were never going to get found. But man, think of all the work we have from burials, from tombs. In fact, I was in the museum today.
I haven't been thinking about this as burial work, but it's kind of a nice analogy.
And it's a burial work about the things that you find that are important, because when I look at this work, it's not that I can see that relationship with your grandfather, but it has an emotional tone. Like I was talking about the substance of your work today when we were walking to dinner. And that I think maybe has something to do with it in the way that you handled the form and the volume and all of those things. So it's nice to know that there's some emotional tie there for you.
Look, this recent work that I made, I didn't make it all out at Broken Hill, but the ideas came back. And it's the work that I've been really working on for the last 2 years. It's a huge emotional tie back to Broken Hill. And yet Broken Hill really has very little meaning for me. The name of the project was called Not the Way Home, which is a line from a song about a couple of blokes in Broken Hill, I put my wallet on the table, not the way home, it goes on. And I thought, when I gave my first PowerPoint presentation, I got my brother in Tumbarumba to do a road sign, a photograph of the road sign that said Tumbarumba, and I had a photograph of me, which is actually my Facebook, big profile, standing next to a sign that says Broken Hill. And it was almost, I'm standing there going, well, which way should I go? And we had a conversation about this last night when I was talking about Don Wright's coming to Australia and saying, do you take the road to the left, which is family responsibilities, or the road to the right, which is endless possibilities? And I always loved that kind of image. And, I've just talked about my descendants. Obviously, I'm always going to have this huge connection to family connection. It's a family connection. And maybe when you ask me how I can judge whether I'm a good teacher, is that I'm probably not a tough teacher. I'm more of a nurturer. And I think that comes from a sort of nurturing that I have to kind of keep a family unit sort of interested
keep them
in
together.
Well, not so much together, but interested in what we all do and what our achievements are, which might go back to my ancestor, who was a very well-known explorer, who set out from Scotland and ventured through, strange parts of the world. So maybe I'm just doing a different sort of exploring. But I think my work now has a much more organic. It's less involved now with the metal detritus from farms and more to do now with the sort of stone and rock that I found out at Broken Hill. However, having said that, there was a revelation. It's really interesting when other people talk about your work, and you've made some interesting comments about my work too in the last 2 days. The curator of the Not the Way Home exhibition, Owen Craven, who also edits Artist Profile magazine, was giving a public talk about the work. And I'd been looking for a word. I wanted a word that, in the titles of the work, because how can I say this? I went to an old dry creek bed behind the farm where we were staying in Fowler's Gap, north of Broken Hill. And when it rains out there, the water rushes down and everything gets cut off for 3 days, and then it all dries up and it's gone. But that rush is huge. Mm-hmm. And there was an old water tank, again, similar to the story that I just talked about at Tumbarumba. It was wrapped around a tree. I mean, seriously wrapped around a tree. And I took lots of photos of it, and there were great cracks and bends in the metal. And I thought of titles like flung. I thought of titles to do with crash, speed, force. And Owen Craven said, and Merran Esson's work is about the collision of. And I went, collision? Absolutely, it's about collision. It's about that collision between man and nature. Always has been. And I think I've made some pieces now, and I guess, even if you look at those larger pieces where there's the sense of the pierced metal, but there's also the sense of the organic. And I guess it has that, I called that one of those pieces Back of Beyond, which is very much an Australian. Well, one was called Beyond the Black Stump, and the other one was called Back of Beyond, which was all that thing about, well, where are you going out past the Black Stump, which is very much an Australian term. Or, he lives out by the Black Stump somewhere. Was that kind of... so it was about that collision of man with nature. And I think I've always been fascinated in that. Mm-hmm. Even when my mother tried to get me to paint the landscape, and I was more interested in painting the fence.
Because the fence was man trying to control nature.
Trying to control nature.
It's the same contain reason I use fences in my work.
Mm. Yeah, and boundaries, the kind of boundaries. And the boundaries that I cross as an artist between a training that I did, which was very much a studio training. So I learnt to slip cast, and I learnt to throw, and I learnt to make my own glazes. And I actually did, although I said I can't do it, I did learn to adjust glazes. And so maybe it's those boundaries that I'm trying to cross now between, it's that age-old thing, I don't really want to get into it, between art and craft, and the boundaries between functional ceramics and sculpture. Because I don't believe that sculpture should come with a prefix, i.e. ceramics. You're either a sculptor or not. Right. If you have to say you're a ceramic sculptor, it's almost like you're making an apology for being a sculptor who uses clay. Mm. So, but those are boundaries that I think lots of us cross in ceramics. Garth Clark writes about that really well when he said, what's the difference between ceramics and sculpture? And his answer was about $5,000. So a lot of people who are getting $50 for a bowl would love to cross that boundary into sculpture, and it's not an easy thing to do. I don't think I've done it, but I know I'm more interested in that collision between those boundaries. And it took Owen Craven to see that in the work that I was doing, just from seeing a water tank wrapped around a tree.
And it's interesting, when you were saying that, I was thinking about vulnerability, because when metal, with enough water, metal, rock, anything will change, whether it's the slow rain over hundreds of thousands of years, or the freeze-thaw cycle, or in this case, the flash flood. But I'm interested when materials that are inherently solid and not movable become movable through nature. So like we've just had these really horrific tornadoes in the States, and the damage that it causes is horrible, but it's beautiful. Like when you look at the aftermath, if you can divorce the fact that this is people's lives, that wreckage is sublime. I mean, just looking at those houses, the shards, it's chaos, but it's almost like you look at those collapsed homes and they have fallen down perfectly. Like they're piled in a way that nothing but nature can do.
And maybe that particular collision between nature and man trying to build things is always going to be there. It's huge. It's like trying to stop a lava flow. I was talking to somebody yesterday about Cyclone Tracy, and he was saying to me, well, you can kind of survive cyclones if you keep the house on the side of the house on the lee side of the cyclone open, so that there isn't that build-up of pressure inside that pops the roof, and that you lose a lot of stuff, but you maybe can save part of the house. Tornadoes are sort of different to cyclones in a way, because they're such a circular, but they're fascinating. I mean, I'm totally fascinated by any of those sort of world's wildest weather, volcanoes erupting. If one of those is on television, I'm there watching it. And I remember one of my colleagues once saying, well, of course, you're interested in geology, you're interested in those things that are going on. The fact that we happen to be living at this moment, on a planet which the centre of this is still boiling and you know, there's a kiln underneath my feet. I'm not quite sure how many miles down it is, but I know it's there. Right. And, it's fascinating. That collision, we really can't control that collision. Like we can't control the tornadoes.
And destruction and rebirth go so hand in hand. You know, I mean, everything from the harvest cycle to something like a volcano where, you know, you like let's say Vesuvius, you know, without that eruption, we would know so little about that society, but it froze everything in place. You know, and now it's one of the most famous small towns in the world.
There is a really lovely film that the BBC put out called Ceramics: A Fragile History. And if you ever get a chance to find it, there are 3 episodes. The first episodes are lovely. Look, BBC put it out, so it's a bit romantic. But it goes back through the history. And one of the parts of that I really loved was that there was a shard washed up on the banks of the Thames, and they took that through to the museum and they treated it very gently, and that had texture on it. They cleaned out this texture and put some mouldings in there, and they took a moulding of what this texture was, and they discovered it was a fingerprint with a fingernail on it. So this sort of asked the question, and the archaeologist that was talking on the film said, you know, we have this vision that back in the Dark Ages, and everybody was sort of peasant potato growers, that everybody worked their fingernails to the quick. But this was obviously somebody who was leaving an impression on this pot, which obviously had been a pot at some stage, which had a long fingernail. It begged the question of, well, why did this person have a long fingernail? And maybe he or somebody else sort of made the comparison to a guitarist who might grow one long fingernail to be the pick that's being used. So they took a print of this in case they find another pot somewhere, and they can sort of, through fingerprint analysis, forensically tie it to the same pot. Why you would bother? And we're talking back, 3,000 or 4,000 years, I don't know. But, there's something quite interesting about that. So the time of when that piece was made and how it was made and why it was made is quite fascinating, that sort of frozen moment that you were talking about. And I guess going back to your question to me half an hour ago about time, I'm really fascinated in the finding of shards and the finding of history and what that means and how we can interpret that. And, I set projects with the students where I get them to look back in time. One of our projects at the moment in first year is that they have to look back at a tradition and those senses of tradition. And we talked about this last night because I've got 2 Afghan war rugs here. And I was making that comparison that the traditions of rug making in Pakistan and Afghanistan, in those countries that make these Afghan war rugs, hasn't changed for centuries. But in 1989, when Russia invaded and all the Kalashnikov rifles and the tanks, so this rug behind you now, instead of it having pretty flowers around the outside, there are bullets and missiles around the outside. So it's about this kind of contemporary subject matter that entered an age-old tradition of rug making. And the same thing can happen in ceramics, that, the Egyptians and the Greeks coiled their pots. Right. I've got students, I coil my pots, rolling out coils now is not so different in the last 2,000, 4,000 years. So what's my subject matter? What sort of images am I going to put on there? What am I going to use? This collision between man and nature? That's always been there as well, probably.
What I found to be interesting about your work too is it is obviously touched by human hand, but it doesn't have the human touch of, let's say, one of Sandy Lockwood's cups. This undulating rim is so different than that undulating rim. And in some ways, I don't see your hand in there. I see more of nature's hand.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
Yeah. So how did you decide to go that direction? Is it because you wanted it to be more about nature than you as an individual?
I don't think I really thought about that. That's an interesting question. Wow. Can you write that out for me? Can be my next artist statement. Look, there's a pot behind you over there, and I think one of the frustrating conversations that I had with my subconscious when I was driving between Sydney and Melbourne all those years ago was that, there's always a fingerprint in the glaze or on my pots which shouldn't be there. And I figured that if I put a lot of finger marks on my work, you wouldn't know which were the right ones and which were the wrong ones. And so I started by putting a lot of finger marks on there. I think that's just something you work through. So there's a pot behind you that's, over 10, 12 years old that I'm referring to about the finger marks. And the other one that you're referring to that doesn't seem to have any finger marks on it at all is maybe a confidence that I have now that I don't have to worry about where the finger marks are.
You're just totally intuitive in that moment.
Yeah. And the finger mark isn't an issue anymore, but it was a huge issue for me back then.
Because when I see this, I can see a stiffness that reflects what you're saying now, that there's more confidence in that work, or confidence in the process of making.
There's also confidence in the glazing as well.
Right.
And that comes from having worked with some really shitty batches of copper carbonate and having had some pieces that didn't work. Right. And, it's also having some disappointment. I've played around with some low temperature glazes on top of high temperature glazes and doing third firings. And I've done that on test pieces. And then the first time I committed that to a really big pot, that's scary. You have to have a lot of courage to say, look, I spent a week making this pot and now I'm going to put this strange glaze on the inside.
And see what
happens. And I remember the first time I did that, it looked like somebody had been ill inside the pot. And I just went, well, this is not working. And so I made a very instinctive decision to put it straight back in the kiln and fire it back up to the temperature of the other glaze. And I ended up with runs and crystals and rust and all sorts of things. And through the courage of trying something that didn't work and then the instinct of throwing it back in the kiln and trying something else, I developed a third glaze, which when you see the kind of rusty oranges on my work is the overfiring of another glaze and it's a playing around of. And there is Samuel Styles, who was an 18th century philosopher, once wrote, he who never makes a mistake never makes a discovery. And, I always tell my students that, don't panic, this doesn't work, put something on top of it. But just make sure you know what it was so you can repeat it.
How do you encourage failure as a teacher? Like, is that something you're conscious of?
No, you don't have to encourage that. It happens all the time.
But in the sense of you are nurturing.
Yeah. And you have to say, well, often students, something will come out of the kiln and they'll say, God, I'm going to throw that. And I go, don't throw it out. Live with it for a while. See if there's something there. See, you actually made this. You put thought into it and maybe something went on in the kiln that you didn't expect. Maybe there's something there that can be redeemed. Or maybe it can go back into another firing with another pot on it. Another glaze on it, I mean. I remember listening to, it might have even been Peter Rushforth, who's our grand old man of Australian ceramics. He's in his 90s now. I think it was Peter who said, he has the odd pot that's sometimes been in the kiln 4, 5, 6, 7 times, Eventually there's a point where you have to say enough is enough.
I had friends that I worked for and we used to shoot them. And we would take them out back.
The friends?
No, the pots.
Sorry. That was my mother. That was the mother that stepped in there telling you. That was the wrong part of the sentence. Sorry. Sorry, Ben.
Yeah, no. But it was so much fun because these were people I really looked up to. And I really thought, they were my biggest heroes at the time. And I would work for them on the weekends, on occasion and go down there, wood firers. And they had so many pots that were bad. And I remember one day they were like, okay, it's shooting day. And we just all lined them up and got their gun. And exactly.
I'm actually pointing to my pots that have got holes in them where my fingers went through them. But it's actually to do with shooting. And I'm embarrassed to say this, but, as a country girl who went spotlighting as a kid, I don't remember that I ever shot an animal because I was probably too timid. But I did, I've shot at things and certainly shot at metal, tomato cans and things like that. And of course, the boys would come back after spotlighting and they would shoot up road signs. And in fact, Robert Bell wrote us an article about my work for an exhibition at the National Gallery in Canberra called Transformations. And he talked about that sort of vandalism from country life. And that's what he was referring to, with people just going around and shooting up anything that was metal. And so it's the piercing of that metal. I sort of remember that too from helping my dad repair the water tanks on the farm, where it wasn't shot. It wasn't shot, but, it had been pierced, or an old nail that had been there for a while had worked its way loose and then it all had to be repaired. So I was quite fascinated in that sense that a hole in a metal water tank can render it non-functional. And, the function of water on an Australian farm is huge, that you need to contain it. And when I was doing my master's degree, and I did that in Victoria with Owen Rye, and the subject matter of that master's actually was about subject matter, and it was a lovely quote that Peter Dormer had written in a book called The Art of the Maker, where he said, function is the subject matter, not the purpose. The purpose is art. And that was my first well, it wasn't my first, but it was the first time I kind of acknowledged that I was wanting, that there was a collision going on. I hadn't figured out what the word was collision, but there was this collision going on in my own life when I realised I would never be the thrower that Sandy Lockwood is. And that for me, throwing was not the way that I was going to make my living as an artist. That I was a hand builder, and at that I was a wonky one. I'd already had that conversation with my subconscious by this stage. And so, the subject matter for me was always going to have a rural influence in it, but the subject matter was about function. Pots, I love being a potter. Pots are about vessels and about function. And I discovered I wasn't very good at domestic function. I was okay at it, but I wasn't very good at it. So function as a subject matter, not the purpose, was really important for me, and it was the basis upon which I did my master's, and it was because I wanted the purpose to be art. And, I think the fact that I got invited to go on the road trip to Broken Hill with 10 other fine artists, including Elizabeth Cummings and Guy Warren and Ewan MacLeod and Idris Murphy, people who are really quite established names here in the fine art world, was a fantastic moment for me that my work was perhaps being seen as being on that boundary, and it was up to me to make the best use of it. I don't know that I made the best use of that trip then.
But it seems like it's paid huge dividends after the fact.
Yeah, I actually have found that influences for me take about 3 or 4 years. And I was talking to a poet friend of mine about this, and he kind of rubbed his tummy and said, yeah, they need to go somewhere way down here and rust away for a while, don't they? And I thought, yeah, for me it takes about 3 years, and I've got about another year to go before the 3 years is up from the Broken Hill trip. And I think this next year for me is going to really see the culmination of that work. But also that's hard if you're an educator, because you're not working. You're not making 100 decisions a week about your own work. You're making 100 decisions a week about other people's lives. So, there are some nights when I get home and there's only one decision left. What's for dinner? Yeah. There isn't really a decision about my work. And that has to be hugely detrimental in a way as your development as an artist. And I can pit myself against probably one of our best known ceramic artists here in Australia is Jenny Orchard, and she really doesn't do a lot of teaching. She spends a lot of days in her studios. I'm envious of the 100 decisions a day she's probably making about her own work that I'm not doing.
It was interesting the talk we had the other day about sort of the long-range plan in your life, about when teaching is no longer what you have to do, that you could move on to kind of a different stage in life and what that would mean for you as a maker. And you talked about that one of the things you want to do is travel more, or I guess have the ability to travel. Maybe you decide to just stay in your studio all the time, but you'd have the ability to make that choice. So when you're thinking about transitioning, kind of to another stage of life, I don't want to say retirement, because I don't think you'll be sitting on that couch watching TV. I think you'll be full of activity. What do you think of when you think of the next stage?
Yeah, I don't think artists ever retire. It's kind of interesting because I've got a couple of friends who've got quite arthritic, and they sort of say, I can't make pots anymore. And I go, seriously? I'm sure there must be something you could make. Stick your heel in a block of clay and see what. I don't know, but I don't have arthritis to a point where that's a problem. Yeah, I won't retire. Look, and I think I have to teach, but it's not that I have to teach for money. We were talking today about those different irons that you have in different fires particularly as an emerging artist. So for, young kids that are coming out of college, a bit of writing, a bit of blogging, a bit of social networking, a bit of teaching, and what I was saying before about, work in some of the, really ordinary kind of community centres and not so ordinary community centres. And, I've flown out to Griffith and worked for the Griffiths Potter Society. That was so much fun to do things like that. But I kind of have to teach because I actually love the contact with students. I mean, students are amazing, and they, particularly these students, they've got so much guts to, tackle a material which is as old as the hills, but actually has a fairly lowly worth. Because, a lot of people are they're thinking lifestyle. They're thinking about how they can, have ceramics as part of something else, and I like that. That's really exciting.
And I think that is what makes you a natural teacher.
Maybe it does. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, the next part would be to, have a studio. Oh yeah, I'll be making work in the studio and making 100 decisions a day about what to make or where to travel. But where to travel? I haven't seen enough of Australia. I have great desire to go and see the bungles. And one of the things that in talking about the collision of man and nature is that, I lived on a farm, but my father, he was a farmer, but he was an ex-World War II fighter pilot. And we had a gliding club on the property, so I did a lot of gliding with my dad. So I'm fascinated by the earth from the air. And this is interesting. This is another conversation. Oh God, I don't think we should go there. But, the Aboriginal storytelling is often a bird's eye view of things.
Oh, totally.
And, I have a bird's eye view of things. I have an aerial view of things. I love Google Maps. Right. I think Google Maps is the best invention. Thank you so much, Google. And iPhones where I can Google things. So a lot of my drawings are aerial landscapes of mostly, there's an area in southern New South Wales, the Aboriginal term is Bogandara, but it's the Upper Murray. And, I know the Upper Murray pretty intimately. I did a lot of horse riding there as a kid, and we did a lot of gliding over the Upper Murray. And, so that collision, you can see the fence lines and where the roads have gone. And I like the fact that I can see the tracks that a mob of sheep will make. When sheep go down to the waterhole, they go in single file and they leave a little track. Right. It's kind of fascinating, that's why they say follow each other like sheep, So I'm sort of interested in the things that humans will do, hedgerows of trees or, tree rows or fences, which are usually pretty straight. And then the sheep will have this meandering line that will go across the middle of a paddock. So, God, I'm digressing here again, but I think for me, when I stop teaching in the formal sense that I'm doing now, yeah, I'd love to go off and see a lot more. I'd like to see a lot more of Australia, and I think I'd like to go to the Antarctic.
Interesting. It makes me rethink some of these forms too as ice. If they were ice, what that would mean, because ice can melt. So there's a sense of impermanence in ice that's not in stone or steel.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, interesting.
I think, it's the same sort of thing. It's not to do with geology, but it's to do with that sort of, we can't control what goes on down there. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of a little bit fascinating. I'm not interested in the Arctic, so it must be the Antarctic. It must just be to do with what's in my own backyard. I just don't want the 2-week trip or the 4-day trip. If I go from New Zealand, it's 2 weeks. If I go from the south of Southern America, then it's about 2 days. But I believe it's pretty rough. Yeah. Well, I've seen the Poseidon Adventure. I'm not sure.
It's cold water.
But anyway, I don't know. The travel thing, the interesting thing about travel, of course, as you alluded to today with the students at college, is, I gave a talk at the ceramic conference a few years ago, and I called the talk The Ceramic Passport. And then today, when I was trying to get them interested in your talk, I also called it The Ceramic Passport, because it is about how there is a great network of people out there that understand. You've only got to walk into a room of potters and talk about, does your glaze craze? And everybody knows what you're talking about, That's something quite nice about that. And the other thing that's sort of interesting, and might be interesting in the context of this interview, is that when we just recently had a Golgong event here in Australia, and it was a bit of a memorial event because Janet Mansfield passed away earlier this year, and she was such a force in Australian ceramics.
And in really all of ceramics in the Western world.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I think it was Owen Rye who said at the memorial lecture, he said, there's a new word in the ceramic dictionaries, and it's Golgong. You go anywhere in the world and say Golgong, and everybody knows, oh, have you been there? Have you been to the festivals? Did you have fun? What was it like? So, I think that sense of travel and meeting people and being part of a community that actually understands that Goulgong isn't just the town where Henry Lawson was born, but there's actually a ceramic festival held there every 3 years. It's kind of fascinating, I don't know that painters have got that. I don't hear painters saying, I'm going off to Paris every 3 years for a festival. I think there's something more community-based about ceramics, and maybe that appeals to my nurturing side of my personality. I'm not sure.
Oh, I love that. And I mean, the ceramic passport, when you said that today, I was like, that describes the last 5 years of my life. See, I used to think that like networking or making connections always sounded so analytical and business oriented, but it's networking in that sense for me, like meeting people that you share a common interest with is really more about connection. It's not about me getting something from you, or maybe not even about you getting something from me. It's just that we can share that connection. And that's something that's really, really nice. Because I think, the more technology driven we are, sometimes that human to human connection is lost, or maybe superseded is a better way to say it, because you go out to a restaurant and everyone's looking at their phone.
I know. And, we thought we had touch. Thank you, Steve Jobs. I touch. iPhone. And are we leaving an impression? Maybe we are with our emails. Who knows?
Got our digital record now. That is going to be a legacy. Think of all the emails that someone that's say, I don't know, that's maybe like 16 now, that has only been alive during the email, not the revolution, but the email generation. They're going to leave hundreds of thousands of emails somewhere.
They might have got over it by then. I have a grandson that was born about 10 months ago, and he's born into. He's already now watching his sister playing with an iPad. He's somebody picks up an iPhone, iPad. He's looking at it. He's waiting till he's got the chance to press one of those buttons and see what happens. So it's a fascinating time. But that sort of collective, or that maybe that community base in ceramics, it's a bit sort of woo, but it makes me think about why we make the things that we do and what it is about the things that we do. Maybe that collision between function and non-function. But one of my great teaching aides has been Jack Troy. Jack came out to Australia last year, I think it was, or the year before. And he's got a great website, and he's got a cup project on there, which I've stolen. And I mean, I literally have stolen. I copy it. I acknowledge that it's Jack's project. But he has a really lovely comment in there when he asks the students to think about what a cup is. And his comment is, a cup is the one object that touches two parts of your body at the same time. And I think that's really interesting about how you would consider where your hand would go on an object, as that object is also going to go to your lips, and you are going to pour something from one vessel into yourself another vessel. There's a whole pile of poetics going on there, and Sebastian Blackie in his Dear Mr. Leach book has a chapter called Lips, which he's also talking about that opening to a vessel, the lip of a pot, as can go on and on and on. But I think that there is that sense of how we work with a material that is very much part of what we do on a daily basis. And maybe it's why handmade, it has its revivals, Everybody wanted a handmade pot in the 1970s, and then in the 1980s and 90s the dot-coms took over, and everybody wanted to go to the department store. And there's a lovely kind of sense about, the ABC of learning to be a ceramic artist, and you could go right through and find, C is for ceramics and D is for dunting in the clay. The problem was we get to I, and people then rush off to IKEA. And I just wonder how we can ever finish that sort of learning process and stop our clients, particularly from running off to IKEA, and have them sort of stay with us.
Well, I think this is a good place to end.
Good.
I usually plug people's websites, but I think the place to find your work is through your galleries, I would imagine.
I had a website for a while. So, merranesson.com will be up again soon. I did it with Mobile Me, which was a really nice Apple product that they stopped about a year ago, and I couldn't be bothered to do anything about it, so I let it slide. But yeah, the nice thing about the profile that I have now, is it a nice thing? I don't know. it's there. Google. Yeah. Find me on Facebook.
Great. Well, thank you for taking the time
Thanks,
to do
Ben.
this.
This has been fun. God only knows what I'll sound like in playback, but anyway, I may not listen to it for 10 years.
That's okay. Thanks again.
Thanks.
If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities whose lands we reside on in the United States, and recognize that we are uninvited guests on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of over 500 nations indigenous to North America. By acknowledging and reflecting upon the contemporary lived experiences and histories of the Indigenous peoples here and globally, we may begin to take essential steps towards creating a more equitable world. Learn more through the hashtag Honor Native Land initiative of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and consider contributing to Indigenous-led organizations doing important work to further health and wellness, sovereignty, and self-determination of the first people of the lands you reside. This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.